Hi everyone, in this recording we'll introduce geospatial data visualization. Before doing anything else, what exactly are geographic data and how do you read it in? So there are two main types. The first is called vector spatial data and the second is called raster spatial data. Vector data stores any kind of geometric information. It can be points, this is often used for locations of individual things. It can be lines, these are often used for routes, and polygons. So if you have anything which is demarcating a separate area, so it could be counties, it could be a building footprint, these are all vector data. You'll often see these in a format called GeoJSON or shapefile. Unlike vector data, there's a second kind of format which is called raster data. So raster data are spatial data which are measured along an even spatial grid. So you can think of this as like temperature or elevation. You might have it from 1 square kilometer to the next, or even maybe if it's very high resolution data, you might have 1 square meter to the next square meter, all evenly on a spatial grid. You can often also see satellite image data is this kind of format. And we'll see this below. These are all in .tiff typically. There are three very useful packages for working with spatial data: SF and Terra and TMAP. SF and Terra are going to be useful for just reading in the data, also any kind of manipulation. So if you want to subset, if you want to crop, if you want to change the coordinate system, these are all going to be done with SF and Terra. TMAP is just a general purpose visualization package that's specifically designed for geospatial data. So let's look at a few examples. I'm reading in a few different formats. So here is all just vector data, but there are lines, polygons, points. This data set, you can see this is GeoJSON. They're all GeoJSON format. And I'm reading them using readsf, which is a function in the SF package. When you read it in, you get more than just a data frame. It looks at first kind of like a data frame. You have these columns that look like data frame columns. But then you have this extra column called geometry, and you always have this extra column called geometry whenever you have a true vector data set. In this case, it's a multi-line string. So every row here is going to be a sequence of latitude, longitude coordinates, which are just locations on the map, and then it's assuming that they're kind of ordered in a way that it draws a line. So there are 13,000 roads in this road data set. Here's clinics, these are all points. And then glaciers, these are polygons. Okay, how do you visualize this kind of vector data? When you loaded the TMAP library, you can write something like this. So TM shape is kind of like ggplot. It defines a base layer. So we're here passing in the vector data that define that base layer. Once you have that data set read in, you can use any kind of additional layer to encode that underlying spatial information. You're usually going to want to have whatever the type of that underlying vector data used to define whatever additional layer you want. So the roads data set, these were collections of lines. So it makes sense to use TM lines. Right? And this is just that road network for this small zoomed in area of the city. The hospital dataset, those weren't lines, those were points, right? So to visualize points, you can use TM dots. These are just fixing the graphical properties. Kind of analogous, if you didn't have lines or points but had polygons, you use TM polygons. So basically, no matter the type of the vector data, just make sure to match the TMAP type with the underlying data type. And then you'll be able to draw that vector object. Okay, so I showed above that the object looks almost like a data frame. So just like a data frame, it's going to be possible to encode some sort of data in the graphical properties of the objects. Right? So these aren't really encoding any data other than just the locations of those spatial objects. But we know, like for example, in the glaciers object, or the glaciers dataset, we have the minimum elevation, maximum elevation, the slope, the area, the thickness, a bunch of properties about each glacier, right? So instead of just showing the boundaries of the glaciers, you can encode that additional data within the glacier. So here I'm using TM borders just to draw the boundaries, right? But instead of using TM polygon, I'm using TM fill. So TM fill is now allowing me to encode, here color is encoding the thickness variable, and I'm just telling it some properties about how I want it to encode color. This is a little bit different from ggplot. Right? In ggplot, you have to do this aesthetic encoding AES command. Here, you can just directly pass in the name of the variable that you're trying to encode, just quote it, and that's how it's going to encode that data within the graphical mark. I especially like this legend histogram. Right? It's just showing here's a histogram of all the thicknesses across all the glaciers. So you can see there are actually relatively few that are very thick, but the ones that are thick, these tend to be the very large glaciers. And it's a kind of a scented widget. Okay, so far that's all just visualizing vector data. So what about for raster data? We can again use tmap, right? But we're going to need to use a different layer. So first of all, I have to read in the data before I even visualize it. So rast is a command from the Terra package. You can see this is a .tiff file, so it's that spatial grid. This is data from a satellite. So I just saved from some open satellite website. And there are many, many channels in this satellite, so I've picked only one of the channels. Each channel corresponds to a different wavelength of light. Right, so the usual color images are red, green, and blue wavelength of light, but a satellite can pick a whole bunch of other wavelengths too, like infrared and ultraviolet. So this is just one of them. You can see that it's a very even spatial grid, right? Every single pixel is one location, right? And you can tell, there's some sort of shapes. These are actually glaciers in the map. Okay, so got that just by using tm shape, again, to define the object that goes in, and tm raster is just encoding spatially every element in the raster. Okay, so that is for just one channel in a raster dataset. Sometimes you might want to visualize several channels at once, right? Like this would be enough if you were just trying to do elevation or temperature, but if you had several wavelengths of light and you wanted to make it appear like a color image, then you can use something called TM RGB instead of TM raster. So when I saved im, I actually gave it just 3 color channels. So if you just use default without subsetting anything, then you get something that's almost like a color image from space. Right, so this is looking down. These are the mountains. These are like the valleys between the mountains. And here are the glaciers. Okay. So that's how to visualize vector data, how to visualize raster data. There are going to be a lot of situations where you want to combine these visualizations on top of one another. There are a few different ways to do this. So maybe the simplest way is to just use a generic base map. So the idea is you have a vector data set, you want to show some sort of background image to give some context, but you don't actually have a raster data set that gives that kind of satellite background. In this case, you can use some generic R package to download a background map, like a satellite image map, and you can overlay your shapefile vector data on top of that base map. So here, CC location is within the ceramic package. I'm centering it around kind of the center for Madison, and I'm overlaying the 2 TM shape commands. This first TM shape command is used to visualize the raster dataset, which is this base map satellite image. And then the second 2 TM commands are used to overlay the hospital locations, which are a vector point dataset on top of that raster. Okay, so ceramic, useful whenever you don't have any specific kind of raster data that you want to visualize, but you just want to have some sort of background map. Sometimes you do have a very specific raster dataset on which you want to visualize things. So here I'm taking the two glaciers datasets that I showed above. There's this polygons glacier dataset, and then there's this glacier satellite imagery, and I'm going to overlay them on top of each other. But this is actually within a much smaller geographic location than this one. I think maybe it's like one of these small region out here. So what I've done is I've cropped both the raster dataset and the spatial dataset so that they're within this latitude-longitude box. It's a minimum longitude, maximum longitude, minimum latitude box. These are both functions within those spatial data manipulation packages that I mentioned before. Okay, so crop is within the Terra package, stcrop is within the SF package. You can use this for raster and vector manipulation. There are actually many other functions besides crop that you can use to manipulate the underlying raster or vector data. But once you've prepared the data so that they're overlapping, you can do the same kind of TM shape plus layer that you want to encode, then TM shape for the next data set and layer that you want to encode. Is exactly like this. Right here was the base map, and then the clinics, and then the different kinds of layers for each. Now it's this glacier's background image, and then glacier's polygon boundaries, and I'm just overlaying them on top using an RGB and polygons. Okay, so now you can see both types of data in one view.